Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Lawcast. This week, we're doing something totally different from what we normally do. Rather than covering, one show, we're going to try to give you an overview of over 40 years of history. We're going to take a look at the history of New Japan Pro Wrestling. It's the rise, fall, and rebirth of New Japan Pro Wrestling. Kyush, how fired up are you for this one?
There were only two true milestones in this podcast that I knew we had to hit, that I was looking forward to so much that I vibrated with intensity from the desire for it. The first one was Lashley, the second one is New Japan, and we hit them both in the same month.
Man, what a month December's
Holy
been.
crap, Christmas for me.
Yeah, so I would say it's pretty easy to know where to start, but it's a massive task in front of us. But just to start, New Japan Pro Wrestling is founded in January of 1972 by the legendary Antonio Inoki. Um, 72 is kind of the key year in Japanese wrestling history. It gives us the modern setup with New Japan and All Japan being the big two promotions. They were founded respectively by Antonio Inoki and Giant Baba, who were both big stars in Riki Dozan's Japanese Wrestling Alliance. What was the reason for them splitting from the JWA?
Um, there was a difference in opinion, not only over how the promotion should be booked, because obviously All Japan and New Japan became very different promotions as time went on, but it also became kind of a cult of personality thing. Like Antonio Inoki was ready to go out on his own. He was he was trying to branch out and become Japan's first wrestling kind of superstar, you know, and also like it was just kind of falling apart. The problem with Japanese wrestling of that particular time is heavily the Yakuza had a heavy hand in it. Riki Dozan didn't have a firm hand on the promoting aspect of it as time went on. And then eventually, I mean, after he died, it all kind of fell apart.
Yeah, so Riki Dozan was killed by the Yakuza in 1963, is my understanding.
Technically, he was killed by a vague member of the Yakuza with a pea soaked knife. So,
Yeah,
yes.
don't want to get stabbed with a knife soaked with pee.
You sure don't, buddy. You sure don't.
Yeah, just to briefly explain Riki Dozan, he's the godfather of Japanese wrestling. So he was a Korean sumo wrestler. Do I have that right?
Yes. Here's the genius of Riki Dozan too, is basically Japanese wrestling isn't in a unique form unto itself like lucha libre and American pro wrestling are. Japanese wrestling started when GIs brought it over during the occupation of Japan after World War II. So there was a big gap for like a potentially wrestling star as people became enamored of this new kind of form of entertainment. And Riki Dozan stepped into it. And the genius of that booking was that it was always Riki Dozan versus some gigantic monster from another country. And it actually played a gigantic role, more or less depending on who you ask, in helping Japanese people kind of retain their national spirit after obviously the devastating defeat during World War II. And like that sounds ridiculous that a pro wrestler could help a country kind of recapture their pride. But when you hear about the kind of level of attention that his matches were getting in the country, it's gigantic.
Yeah, his match against Luthez drew an 87 TV rating, which means 87% of the TV sets running in the country at the time
For
were tuned
reference,
to his match.
I think the average Super Bowl gets what, like 8% of TVs or something like
Yeah,
that?
50 or something. Yeah, is a good
Oh,
rating.
holy shit.
Yeah. Yeah, just stunning. Everybody was watching this match.
And the one again, he had another match against the Destroyer that was similarly successful. It can't be overstated the degree to which Riki Dozan is important in the history of Japanese wrestling. It's just unfortunate that there's not much to talk about his run in general until the split happens and unfortunately his death, because his run isn't very interesting. It's when the split happens and they separate this out into the history of New Japan that it really starts getting political and fun.
Yeah. So can you kind of explain the differences between the styles of New Japan and All Japan?
All Japan All Japan followed more in the JWA's footsteps. It's more of a kind of a traditional wrestling promotion in terms of that. It was built around the star power of Giant Baba, who is like almost a 7-foot giant. Like he had a lot of classic matches with guys like Andre the Giant and guys like that. He was an attraction. But New Japan Pro Wrestling was always built in Antonio Inoki's image. And Antonio Inoki built his image around the concept that professional wrestlers were the toughest fighters on the planet. He fought Muhammad Ali. He would fight. Yeah, but I mean, that was one of the stupidest fights of all time. He challenged a boxer to an MMA fight, but he could only basically be kneeling the entire fight. It made no sense.
No, one of the all-time debacles in history, and I'd like to cover it kind of in full form at some point. But I think Ali was hospitalized with blood clots in his legs. He got kicked so many times and so hard in that fight.
It's like, imagine playing a game of Street Fighter where your opponent just sweeps the leg every single move. That's that fight. And it's pretty hilarious.
And somehow the judges called it a draw.
Right. But his entire career, basically, Inoki was defined by the fact that he wanted to make people believe that he was the toughest fighter in the world, that wrestlers were the toughest fighters in the world. And his promotion was built to kind of capture that idea. That's where the idea of strong style comes from, that wrestling is the strongest fighting style that there is, which is obviously not true. But I believe that was meant to overcompensate for the fact that it was fake, you know?
How legitimate was Inoki as a martial artist?
Not. I mean, no. I'm not saying that he had no skills whatsoever. Which is obviously true. Like, he had some skills, obviously, but most of it was just that he made other people work while he shot. And that was the Antonio Inoki story.
Got to respect the craft, at least.
Yes. If you have nothing else to do on the internet today, please go on and Google Antonio Inoki slaps, because it was famous. Antonio Inoki slapped people so hard he dislocated their jaws. Like, that was his thing. It was an honor to get slapped by Inoki.
Yeah. I mean, Inoki fights all of the top stars in the world for several decades. He wrestled Hulk Hogan, Bob Backlund, Harley Race, Carl Gotch. He sort of won the WWF title from Backlund in the late 70s. I don't think the title change is officially recognized in the lineage, but they did a hot finish where Inoki's arm was raised, and then he lost the title back to Backlund the next night or a week or two later.
Which that's basically the booking that they always did with American promotions and Japanese ones. It's just screw job, dusty finishes every time.
Yeah. So their guy gets to pose with the title, and he might as well have won it. Who really cares at that point?
Exactly.
So New Japan is part of the NWA for a while. They end up breaking off in the early 80s. The early 80s is when they create the IWGP, the International Wrestling Grand Prix. That's the governing board. This answers the question of why their titles are called the IWGP. Something I never understood until I started researching for this.
And really, I've never gotten a clear answer to whether there actually was an IWGP, like an actual governing board. I don't think so. I don't know if it was
to work.
I don't know if it was created to mock the board of directors that tried to determine all the champions from the NWA, or if it was
seems like more to give it that sports style credibility.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. It's funny that it still exists today when it's so much more obviously a work than it was back then. But yeah, it just became habit.
So New Japan is founded in 72, but the IWGP heavyweight title isn't founded until 87.
Yeah, just about.
So for 15 years, they don't have titles, but instead they had like the equivalent of a playoff at the end of each year. They'd have a big tournament. It had various names over the years. It's now the G1 Climax tournament, but it would be this big round robin tournament where everybody wrestles everybody, and then the top two guys, or I think the format changed a little bit over the years, but at the end, the guys who did the best in the tournament would fight each other to determine who, won the title for that year.
Right. And an important thing to remember about the 80s in terms of New Japan and All Japan was that they were hot years, and both companies would kind of peak into the early 90s, but New Japan especially, I can't overstate how much of a draw Inoki was. to the extent where there were other stars in New Japan during that time. Saji Sakaguchi, who was always like kind of a tag team partner of Inoki's, was a big star. He would even become one of the NWA presidents at one point. But it didn't matter because it was all Inoki. Like if Inoki lost to you, you were a gigantic star. But Inoki didn't lose. Like he just did not lose. He lost probably, I would say, less in terms of how many matches he actually had to how many losses he took, maybe than any wrestler ever except Andre. Like it's right there. And it made him the mainstream attraction that he wanted to be, but it didn't leave New Japan with a lot of stars other than him. And so the same thing was kind of happening in All Japan as Baba got over to the point of his retirement. Like there weren't a lot of stars to carry after. And so these tournaments and everything were meant to crown new stars. New Japan had a lot of trouble with that, though. And that's why a lot of these American wrestlers were winning the tournaments, is it was really just Inoki would only do jobs for giant American stars.
Yeah, so a couple of his notable losses. He lost to Hogan in the finals of the first IWGP tournament in '83. Inoki won the second IWGP tournament in '84. Andre the Giant won in '85, and then Inoki wins it in '86 and '87. And '87 is when they actually create the IWGP heavyweight title, and Inoki is awarded it after he wins the tournament. So that's the lineage of that title, goes back 30 years now.
Yep.
And so in '86, they create the junior heavyweight championship, and just as a bit of a diversion, can you explain kind of the significance of junior heavyweight wrestling in Japan?
Well, in the beginning, there wasn't a ton of significance. A big reason, a lot of people ask me one of the first things when they get into New Japan, not so much anymore because that's kind of shifted a little bit, but in the past, is why the junior heavyweights are kept so separate from the heavyweights, because that's not something that we really do in American wrestling and haven't for like 20 years. But there's a stigma in Japanese wrestling, and it hasn't gone away altogether. And it's basically based because sumo wrestling has been such a gigantic part of Japanese culture for 1,000, 2,000 years. Like it's a gigantic deal. Warrior culture in Japan states that bigger guys are better, period. No matter how athletic you were, no matter how gifted you were as an athlete, it didn't matter, even to a greater extent than we saw in America when it took until the 90s to really break juniors through. It took until about 5 years ago to break juniors through to the next level. Like it took that level of time because the stigma is so significant. So when they put the junior heavyweight championship and they created it, it was more of like a mid-card diversion. Like I don't want to say it was like the hardcore title, like a throwaway, but it might be more like the women's title was in the 2000s, where just like, yeah, whatever, we got an undercard to fill. Junior heavyweights, Tiger Mask is doing some fun stuff, so fine, let's bring him in and have him face some people and whatever. It just seriously was not a gigantic deal, and it never really was, despite having gigantic stars in that role, like Tiger Mask, Jushin Liger in future years, like lots of people. It's impossible for me to overstate to you how hard it was for junior heavyweights to break through, and what a triumph it was when they finally did.
So another famous Inoki loss is 1987, where he does just a brutal 5-minute job to Vader. I watched this match, and it's fantastic.
Now, I think that's the match. Like, if you've ever seen the GIF of Inoki getting spiked on his head on a German suplex,
the nastiest German suplex you've ever seen.
Any other man would be dead. Like, it's that nasty. He folds him like an accordion.
So I think Inoki had wrestled a match before this, and then Vader just comes out and challenges him and absolutely murders him and pins him in less than 5 minutes. This causes a riot in Sumo Hall, and New Japan is subsequently banned from Sumo Hall for 2 years.
If New Japan could have held on to Vader, like this is an unbelievably gigantic win. Like almost to this day, Vader is a big name in Japan, and it's just because of this. He doesn't do a ton else. Like everywhere else he ever went in his career, he didn't spend a ton of time here. He was known to be somewhat volatile.
Oh, wow.
But this, I know, but this was Inoki attempting to create a gigantic heel that he could draw with for years and maybe pass the torch to one day. Unfortunately, because Vader was real, and that is what Inoki prized above all else, was the feeling that they're real fighters, real champions, real warriors. We'll get to that a little bit more a little later.
Yeah. In '89, Vader becomes the first non-Japanese wrestler to win the IWGP Heavyweight Championship, but he ends up leaving for WCW, I think, in 1990, and shows up in Japan here and there after that, but ends up becoming an American wrestler after this. I think for him, it probably would have been best if he had just stayed in Japan too, based on how his American career ended up going.
Yeah, I'll always wonder what would have happened if Vader and the Steiners had just spent most of their careers in Japan. They'd probably just be like deities by now.
Yeah. He just seems like the perfect Japanese monster heel. Is this enormous American with a legitimate athletic background, legitimate badass,
He's
super
their answer.
athletic, and work.
Yeah. All Japan had Stan Hansen. This was supposed to be their answer. Unfortunately, it was Vader.
Yeah. So also around this time, we get the Three Musketeers of New Japan: Kaiji Muto, Masa Chono, and Shinya Hashimoto. Why are they called the Three Musketeers?
They were called the Three Musketeers because they were in the same class, like coming out of the dojo. And that's an incredibly big deal. And I think Jushin Liger was in, I don't think that same year, but I think he was in, like, learning at the same time. So all four of those guys come out at the same time.
We haven't actually talked about the dojo yet.
Yes, the dojo is a gigantic deal. Like, it's important to realize that WWE is producing a lot of talent out of the Performance Center right now. But for the most part, in their entire history, they've let other people create stars for them to take and then build on, right?
Almost. And I would still argue that the Performance Center has mostly taken finished products and polished them up a little bit.
Right. It's important to understand that almost every significant talent that New Japan has ever had, they created themselves. We're talking about kids coming straight out of high school, going into the dojo, spending 4 years in the dojo as young boys, getting roughed up and taught wrestling the proper way before they're ever allowed anywhere near a ring. Then they'll spend like a year or two just like holding ring jackets and getting beat up by Minoru Suzuki on the side of the ring, and just basically like helping out and assisting to teach them humility and pride in what their craft. And then they're sent on a learning excursion somewhere overseas and then brought back, and then they're allowed to be wrestlers on the main roster. Nobody debuts without 5 years of work. God. Like, that's a level of dedication and intense training that is just not matched anywhere in the world and never will be, really.
No, I mean, in the old days that was kind of how it worked, but today, guys are in the ring 6 months after they start training.
Right. And I mean, that still is the case a little bit today. Like, they've rushed that timeline up for some of the new guys and stuff like that. It's not exactly the same as it used to be, but that's the dojo concept kind of defines not only New Japan, but Japanese wrestling in general. But the big deal about the Three Musketeers is that Muto, Chono, and Hashimoto come up at the same time. And without them, it's arguable that New Japan, I'm not going to say they may not have survived the 90s, but Inoki's on his last legs. He needs somebody to pass the company on to. There aren't a lot of options. And then along come these three incredibly charismatic, incredibly credible, awesome guys in totally different ways. And they're going to carry the company for the next 12 years. Like, that's incredible fortune. And at the same time, All Japan has the exact same thing happen with Kawada, Kobashi, and Misawa.
Yeah. So Kaiji Muto, obviously well known to American fans as the Great Muta. Masa Chono had a pretty significant run in WCW. Hashimoto, to my knowledge, never really had a run in America, did he?
No, and I think that's because he was the most valuable to New Japan, especially in the late 90s when kind of WCW was going on. He was the guy. He was sort of the successor to Inoki in terms of like that tough guy, that like ultimate warrior who couldn't be defeated and had that burning spirit inside of him. Like, was
he a sumo?
I don't know if he ever actually did sumo, but that was a large part of his appeal, is that he looked like a sumo.
Yeah, he was a big 300-pound guy.
Exactly.
So 91 is a big year for New Japan. This is the first time they run the Tokyo Dome. It's a co-promoted show with WCW, the first of several WCW New Japan Super shows. These are regrettably not on the WWE Network. Are these on New Japan World?
I actually don't know. I've never looked for them.
I'm wondering about the rights, but I mean the fact they're not on WWE
I,
Network says that I assume WCW didn't actually own these shows.
I'm not sure anybody owns these
Yeah,
shows,
it
to
might
be
be one of
perfectly
those.
honest. Yeah, I think it's just one of those kind of in the middle. I had to torrent it way back in the day when we did a review of Rumble and the Rising Sun, but like I'm not sure these shows really exist anymore.
Were these shows any good? The cards look fascinating, but I have no
They're
idea. Yeah.
Rumble and the Rising Sun specifically, which I think was either 91 or 92. I think it was 91. Is specifically fascinating because there's a lot of really good stuff on there. Like the Steiners come over. Uh, it introduced me to Tom Zink, which I'll always thank that card for.
Rest in peace.
And it's main evented by Tatsumi Fujinami versus Ric Flair,
Yeah.
which is that famous he wins the NWA title in Japan but not in America thing.
Yeah, he won the NWA title, but not the WCW title because
Yes.
Flair was thrown over the top rope, and that's a disqualification under WCW rules. So they came back and did Flair against Fujinami at Super Brawl, which is just a fascinatingly WCW thing that they had Flair wrestle a Japanese guy that I don't think any of the American fans knew anything about in a pay-per-view main event.
That's always been the problem. Like WCW and WWE both experimented a ton with involving Japanese talent during the late 80s, early 90s. The problem is nobody in America has any idea who the fuck these people are because they can't watch them wrestle. So if you're in the wrestling business, of course, these are big names. This is a big deal. Fujinami versus Flair. If you're not in the business, who the fuck is Fujinami?
Yeah, unless you were one of 500 people who traded Japanese wrestling tapes back then, nobody knew who he was.
Exactly.
And he didn't speak English, I don't think, and WCW's production department was not going to be able to produce kind of the video packages they needed to explain who he was.
God, no. No. They weren't going to be able to do that. And it's always been one of those things until New Japan World came along and they finally broke through to like produce like footage that Americans could actually see. It's really hard to explain to people now who are getting into New Japan how hard it used to be a fan of Japanese wrestling. It wasn't something you could just watch. You couldn't just turn on Access TV and watch the latest show. You couldn't just go on YouTube and watch all these clips that are like English subtitled, for God's sakes. It wasn't available. You had to torrent it. You had to buy tapes. It was a thing you had to work in order to follow and accomplish. Like it wasn't easy by any stretch of the imagination. So imagine how weird that you feel now as a New Japan fan when nobody you know has any idea what it is. And multiply that times a million back in this day when you have to be tape trading with Dave Meltzer in order to watch the shows.
And who wants to do that?
I mean, if he wants to give me his number, I mean.
Yeah, so this Tokyo Dome show in the first week of January is what has now evolved into Wrestle Kingdom, but they didn't come up with that name until the early 2000s. 92 was the first time they ran it on January 4th, and that just became the tradition. What's the deal with that? It's kind of weird to me that they do it, even if it's January 4th could be a Monday, a Tuesday, any day of the week, and it's just January 4th is when their big show is.
I'm trying to think of the actual specifics of it. What it is it's a huge, like not tourism is the word, but it's like a vacation week for basically all of Japan. And it's a week where they travel to different parts of Japan and they do a bunch of stuff. They'll go to like Japanese Disneyland. It's one of those kind of family event weeks. You know what I mean? And so they did it that way so it could be like their big attraction during a time where the most possible people are able to see it out of work with their kids, bring them to Wrestle Kingdom. It's in the middle of Tokyo. It's one of those kind of things. I don't know exactly what the holiday is off the top of my head. I did know once, but things are falling out left and right. But it's one of those kind of things.
But yeah, they've now been doing this for over 25 years. This is what has evolved into Wrestle Kingdom.
Right.
So throughout the 90s, they continued to be hot. Their working agreement with WCW starts to really pay off when WCW catches fire with the NWO storyline. And I think, as most people know, the NWO storyline was inspired by the UWF's invasion of New Japan. So let's first start with what was the UWF, or UWFI, as I sometimes see it referred to as.
The UWF was initially I told you that Antonio Inoki wanted people to believe that wrestling was real, basically. Not just real, but the realist. And UWF was an extension of that went further. It basically said, what if all the fights actually were real? Or at least were contested between people who really could fight. And then that sort of branched off and became an extension of itself, where it's like, no, we're just going to do shoot fights. And there'll be some working, but mostly shoot. And that became the idea of like, we're way realer than all the other wrestling, even Inoki's brand. And so that's why they were a little bit combative even then, but they always had a huge following for such a small company because there was real appeal in that. Like Inoki taught people to want real professional wrestlers that really fought. And so this is sort of kind of like the very beginning, like the vestigial trace of the MMA craze, which would later come to Japan, because that's what they wanted. They wanted the realest possible professional wrestling at the time.
So were the outcomes predetermined, but it's really stiff, or what? Like, what was the deal? Stiff
To some
work,
extent, we're talking
like
about
cooperative
actual.
shoot.
There was some cooperative shoot. There was some predetermined, but about half the cards on some of these shows would just be genuine shoot fights.
I'm fascinated by that. And how did they determine what was going to be a work and what was going to be a shoot?
You got me. Like, to be honest, like it always seemed very confusing to me how exactly they booked it or how they wanted to present that stuff. There would be people on the shows who weren't really shoot fighters, and just like in like the undercards and stuff. So it was kind of a mismatch of that sort of thing. Now, when it kind of went out of business like 3 separate times.
Yeah, that's what I noticed reading the Wikipedia page was, yeah, there seemed to be sort of 3 separate incarnations of it.
Because it was basically an indie promotion. And despite the fact that it got a lot of attention, there's just not a lot of money in running indie promotions in Japan at this point when you have the 2 gigantic companies sucking up all the money. So it kind of went out of business, and then it came back, and it went out of business, and it came back as UWF International, which is what the I is for. And that one was built around, I'm probably going to butcher this, but Nobuhiko Takada. Takada is like the top guy of that promotion. And he immediately starts calling out everybody. The top stars of All Japan, the top stars of New Japan, the top stars of WWE, like everybody. Like, I can kick your ass, let me kick your ass. And that inevitably leads into the invasion storyline.
Yeah, so they invade New Japan. I assume the basis here is they're saying, we're the real tough guys. You guys are a bunch of fake pussies. We're going to kill you.
Exactly. And despite that being the case, they invade New Japan, and in a show where it's all UWF versus New Japan guys, the New Japan guys defeat every single UWF guy in a gigantic squash.
Hey, that sounds kind of familiar.
Yeah, it sure does, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of, I think, inevitably the problem with invasion storylines is kind of working out who's going to win and who's going to lose. But yeah, in this case, New Japan had the booking power, and Inoki put all of his guys over. And this storyline was still hugely successful, but
Yes.
It feels like it wasn't a fraction of what it could have been.
Well, it's interesting because the first show drew gigantically. Like, we're
Not
talking
95, the $6 million gate.
Yes. And I mean, there were 2 shows. There was one that was New Japan versus UWF, gigantic. And then there was a second show, which was Takada versus Kaiji Muto again. And I think that one was, I can't remember which one was the bigger one, but one of those 2 shows holds the biggest gate in the history of Japanese wrestling.
Yeah.
And that's how big the storyline was. And it was so brief. It was over in like 2 months.
Oh, that's crazy.
Yeah. I mean, they blow it off very quickly. But that idea, the idea of an invasion of badasses, is what inspired, I think, the third show that they do, which I think they have like one more match and that blows it off, is the one that Bischoff is actually at, which gives him the idea.
Yeah, the wheels start turning in his head. What if we could do this in America? What if we could do the WWF versus WCW? And it's kind of amazing that Vince never thought of that. Like, when Vince got his hands on Ric Flair, I guess they kind of did it with Flair because he brought in the title belt, but they didn't go anywhere near all the way with that.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you think about it, at around the same time, Vince had Flair, Sid, Kerry Von Erich. Like, he could have done an NWO invasion.
Yeah, but I mean, Vince would have put all all of his own guys over, and we know how it would have ended because we saw how it ended when the WWF did the invasion.
Yeah.
So, as this company is seemingly hitting its peak, Inoki is winding down his in-ring career. So he starts doing a series of matches that was called the Final Countdown, and it was like he would kind of redo his previous matches. He fought Vader again. I think in some cases he redid like shoot fights he had done as works this time.
Yep.
It's an interesting concept. His retirement goes on for several years. He wrestles Sting. May have gotten a match with Hogan somewhere in there. I don't remember exactly.
I know Muta gets a match with Hogan in there somewhere, which is quite hilarious. And probably the best match Hogan ever worked if you want to look online for it.
And then Inoki's final match is not against a wrestler, but against Don Fry, who's an MMA fighter. What's the deal with that?
Don Fry was an enormous star. And we're talking about the mid-90s at this point, and MMA is starting to become a thing. Like, I don't know when exactly it is that Pride really becomes the juggernaut in Japan that it eventually became, but we're talking right about the era where MMA is really starting to hit its stride. And Don Fry, as a giant American monster with a huge mustache that beats the shit out of everybody, was a huge star. And he and Inoki were calling each other out in the press. It became a national news story. And not the least of which, because one thing we kind of glossed over here is that Inoki initially retires in like 89, okay? Like late 80s. And then becomes a member of the Japanese government.
Yes, the Diet.
Yes, like an actual, like, for real, serious member of government. That's how famous he is. He trumps himself.
I believe they sent him to Iraq to negotiate with Saddam Hussein the release of Japanese hostages, or like people from the Japanese embassy who were trapped there during the Gulf War.
Which is madness, because I feel like Inoki would just slap him in the face.
Surprised he didn't. Saddam was a big wrestling fan, though. I think we talked about Saddam and Sheikh Adnan al-Kaisi in that story when we did one of the Sergeant Slaughter shows.
Absolutely. And it's funny to me, the idea that Saddam Hussein was a tape trader who knew about Japanese wrestling. Like, I love that idea.
It's just like Kim Jong-il and Dennis Rodman.
Yeah.
So this is the end for Inoki. His retirement draws a $7 million gate, a sold-out Tokyo Dome. They're at the top of the world, and it's all about to go to shit because we are now getting to Inokism.
Okay, now before we start to talk about Inokism, it's important to put into context where we are. After an incredibly successful run in the 90s, like absolutely amazingly great business. Everywhere in the wrestling world did great business in the mid-90s, that's just how it is. All of New Japan stars are starting to get old and stale. Like Muto, Hashimoto, Chono, they're older guys now. They're not moving like they used to. They're not as great as they used to be. They're all kind of stale. They haven't made a lot of new stars for them to compete with. Okay, they're in the same kind of place that they were when Inoki initially retired in the late 80s. Like, who's going to come next? And so, in a rabid attempt to figure out who's going to be next, Inoki makes a decision. And it's similar to the decision that Vince McMahon made in the early 2000s, where he's like, I know I want somebody to be the next big star, and I want him to be exactly like The Rock. And so began the search for the guy with abs who could cut a promo and look hot. That was the thing. In Japan, in New Japan, Inoki said, I know who I want to follow me after, and he's got to be exactly like me.
I can't tell you Inoki morphed into Vince McMahon in that moment.
Yeah, he sure did. And so began the scourge of Inokism, the most self-destructive thing any wrestling promoter has ever done in the history of the wrestling business. And I am dead serious when I say that.
What is Inokism?
Basically, the idea was, I explained earlier how Inoki was obsessed with the idea that wrestling was the strongest art, that wrestlers could beat anybody. And it just so happened that here, now that MMA had become a big thing, was an opportunity to test that theory. if wrestlers could defeat MMA stars as they were becoming huge stars in their own right, well, then obviously wrestlers were better. And Inoki believed that he himself could have kicked any of these guys' asses. So what he begins to do, wrestlers over regular wrestlers, that's first of all. That's dumb, but at least it's understandable why he would do that, because these guys are gigantic stars in Japan at this point. They're big deals, okay? But the second thing that he does is decide, well, my wrestlers are the toughest. Let's put them in shoot fights.
Yeah. So he takes his professional wrestlers, Jushin Liger, Yuji Nagata, guys like that, and he has them fight shoot fighters in shoot fights.
Can you grasp the enormity of how stupid this is?
Yeah. Can you imagine if Vince McMahon during the Attitude Era had said, we're going to have Steve Austin fight Dan Severn in a shoot fight?
And it's even worse because the idea is for 20 years at this point, you built your entire identity as a brand on the idea that these guys are real fighters, the best fighters, the strongest, the greatest.
And people buy it in Japan.
Yes, it's serious. It's real. There are people who understand that it's predetermined, that it's fake, but it's meant to feel like a sporting event, like a real fight. That's prized. That's the goal. And you're feeding them to real fighters, and they're getting their asses kicked.
Yeah.
Poor Yuji Nagata.
Look, like I said, Steve Austin's a tough guy, but you put him in a fight against a Ken Shamrock or a Dan Severn, yeah, he's going to get pounded. He's
And
not a real fighter.
A lot of these guys have legitimate amateur wrestling backgrounds. Like most Japanese wrestlers have at least some amateur wrestling in their past. I mean, it's a big deal in Japan, especially in high school. That does not mean you are ready to handle Yuji Nagata. If you know anything about mixed martial arts, these two names are going to make you wince. Yuji Nagata has exactly 2 shoot fights in his entire pro wrestling career, and his entire shoot fighting career. They are against Mirko Krokop and Fedor Emelianenko.
Oh my God. Yeah, like
He
just
gets
the insanity of this.
Humiliated.
How long did he last?
Not even the first round, man. Not even close.
I mean, we had another good test of this when CM Punk tried to do a UFC fight, and he lasted all of 2 minutes.
And that's actually a great corollary, because that's how a lot of these fights went. These guys aren't MMA fighters, and they were also not given proper time, proper training. They were just fed into these fights. And you saw how CM Punk did after, 2 years of training?
Yeah.
How do you think Jushin Liger did with no warning?
Probably pretty shitty.
And this also manifests itself in the ring. The most famous example is Shinya Hashimoto, is the incredible, resilient, can't be beaten, tough as nails warrior, built in strong style's image. And in 1999, a guy named Naoya? God,
I don't know how to say it. Yeah, I look at that first name and it just puzzles me.
Naoya Ogawa shoots on him in the middle of the ring, humiliates him, and diminishes his star for the rest of his career.
That's what I wanted to ask is, how did this affect these guys? The Liger, Nagata, after they got their asses kicked in these shoot fights, how did that affect their star power?
For guys like Liger and some of the other guys that tried it, it really didn't. It's not like they had a lot invested in Jushin Liger as a main eventer.
The other thing with Liger is he wrestles in a costume anyway. I assume they didn't let him wear his Power Ranger outfit in the shoot fight.
But Nagata was somebody that they were legitimately pushing into the main event. Nagata and Kensuke Sasaki were the guys who they intended to follow as the next big main eventers. So Nagata being fed into these shoot fights was horribly embarrassing and set his career back for years. Shinya Hashimoto was a devastating moment because it broke people's confidence in him in that role. He couldn't play that role anymore. And the biggest problem was it made the big stars in New Japan lose faith in the company. Yeah. Before the next, I guess, 3 or 4 years are out, Muto, Hashimoto, and Chono are all going to be gone. They're going to leave because they so disagree with this booking style. That's all of your top stars.
Yeah. Where did they end up going?
Uh, Muto goes to All Japan and eventually becomes president of All Japan and kind of runs it for a good long time. Hashimoto would go on to form Zero One, which was
Yeah.
it was more of an independent promotion, which is sort of a mark of exactly how far the star falls after that shoot fight. Like he's not on Chono and Muto's level to a large extent after that. And Chono kind of sticks around New Japan. He actually winds up he starts a fashion line. You know, he's
Oh, as one does.
Chono just kind of hangs around, but he's by far the most beat up of the three. So he doesn't wrestle very long after this.
This is such insanity to me. Like, did this discredit professional wrestling in Japan?
It's probably not a huge coincidence. Like wrestling was already going to have a fall because inevitably after a gigantic boom, you're going to have a valley after that peak. It happened to WCW, happened to WWE, happened to New Japan, All Japan, everybody. It happens to everybody.
You just hope for a soft landing and that wherever we fall, it'll still be higher than where we were before, as it was in WWE's case.
But let me put it into perspective for you. In the early 2000s, after Giant Baba's death, Mitsuharu Misawa leaves All Japan and takes every single wrestler in the company but two with him to form Pro Wrestling Noah. Despite that devastating fall for All Japan, losing all of their talent, New Japan falls farther.
That's crazy.
So I just need you to understand how much they destroyed themselves. It takes a full decade to turn this around, to even begin to turn it around.
So by 2005, Inoki is forced out of the company because they've just completely collapsed. They've gone from selling out the Tokyo Dome in the late 90s, drawing $6-7 million gates, to Inoki's gone. Now, as I said, the WWF fell a long way, but Vince McMahon, there was never any question that Vince was going to stay in charge of the company. We talked WCW maybe had a bigger fall, but there were other factors at play there too. This is remarkable to me.
Yeah, eventually, like the Inoki family has to sell the company to the company that makes the WWE SmackDown versus Raw games, which is pretty hilarious, Ukes, who then eventually sell it to Bushiroad, which is a trading card game. And this is how low the value of New Japan got by the mid-thousands. They sell that for $6 million. That's it.
Ooh, well, still more than WCW sold for, but yeah, that's pretty bad.
But this is still like an active company.
They sold for what they drew just from ticket sales for one show in 1996 or 1995.
Fuck.
Yeah. I want to talk about Brock Lesnar's New Japan run too, because this is something that's endlessly fascinating to me. So Brock Lesnar left the WWF in 2004, signed a really long non-compete agreement, but eventually managed to sue his way out of it and got to wrestle in New Japan. And they pushed him hard. I understand why. I mean, they're getting a young top American star, natural heel, also a guy with legitimate credentials. He hadn't done the UFC yet, but he's still an NCAA champion amateur wrestler. They put the IWGP title on him. He has a few defenses. One of them is a really shitty match against Shinsuke Nakamura.
Yeah, don't go and watch
Wrestle
that.
Kingdom. I did. It was really, you're so excited. You're like, oh my God, Lesnar fought Nakamura. And you turn it on, it's like, what is going on here? Who are these guys?
I need you guys to understand, if you go back and try to watch history, that Shinsuke Nakamura was not the Shinsuke Nakamura you know until about 2009. And anytime before that, he sucks. And Brock Lesnar does not care about this. He left WWE to become a pro football player. His childhood dream. Yeah. He failed. It did not work.
Didn't work out.
This is the easy money. Like, he's just trying to come here to get paid. He doesn't give a fuck about this.
Was he lazier here or in his current WWE run?
I think even today, when his matches aren't great and he's lazy, he still takes a certain amount of pride in being as good as he is when he wants to be. There was none of that here. It was just a petulant young guy, just not giving a shit, had no appreciation for anything about where he was, probably didn't even really know. It's not like he came up in the wrestling business obsessed with New Japan tapes. It's just it's lost on him.
Yeah. So he wrestles some really shitty matches, is the IWGP champion, and then leaves the promotion with the title after a pay dispute and goes to work for Inoki.
Yes, he wanted more money to do the job because he was actually going to lose the belt, ironically, to Hiroshi Tanahashi. And they refused to pay him. So Inoki had started a new promotion called the Inoki Genome Federation.
Christ.
Just right up there with Wrestle and Romance. The Inoki Genome Federation, which was also half shoot fight, half worked fight.
Well, naturally.
And he'll wind up losing his IWGP title, which has actually been vacated in New Japan. So it's not a real title anymore. But he loses the physical belt to Kurt Angle, who promptly takes it to TNA and says, hey, I'm the IWGP champion.
But he's not.
And that caused a lot of confusion. Eventually, Kurt Angle would go to New Japan and lose to Shinsuke Nakamura so that they could kind of unify.
Yeah, was Nakamura the legitimate IWGP champion at that point?
Yes, so that was the real fight. It was basically between them, but New Japan didn't really advertise it that way.
I mean, I think they could have done some business with that, but I can understand if they wanted to just kind of gloss over that old shame.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, we've covered the fall. I think one of these Tokyo Dome shows in here only draws about 10,000 people.
Yeah, I think that was the tag team one that you're thinking of. Yeah, it's a dark fall. We're talking about, in order for like 4 Wrestle Kingdoms in a row, they bring someone in from outside the company to main event their biggest show of the year because they don't have the stars to do it themselves. And the selling point is all the other guy, from Toshiaki Kawada to Jun Akiyama to Satoshi Kojima and Kaiji Muto, who were New Japan guys who left because of Inokism, and they begged them to come back to help them.
I will point out this sounds quite similar to WWE's current setup for WrestleMania.
You're not wrong. And that's desperately grasping at straws. When you can't produce your own stars, you are in a serious trouble.
Because eventually those guys all get too old to wrestle, and we're starting to see that with WWE now.
Now, an important part that we're going to get to during this next section, but I just want to point it out here, is that every company, probably in wrestling history, has had one defining passing of the torch moment. At least one, right? Is that fair to say?
Yeah.
Like Flair passing it to Sting, or Tenryu, or not Tenryu, oh man, I'm totally Jumbo Suarta passing it on to Mizawa, or like there's so many examples throughout history. Andre passing it to Hogan passing it to Warrior, etc. We haven't brought one up yet because there hasn't been one. And I think that's
nobody, when you look at this, nobody has gotten put over in years now.
That's a big, is putting people over in that way never really becomes a thing. Jobs were something that Inoki did for political reasons, not to get people over. And that's something that never really changes until a very specific moment, which we will talk about in a bit.
Yeah. So we've covered the fall. I mean, it seems like this company was probably on the brink of going out of business, or at least I think they considered not running the Tokyo Dome anymore, because what was the point of booking a 50,000 seat building and drawing 10,000 people? You're just taking a bath.
Exactly.
And there's no pay-per-view in Japan, right?
Yeah. That's a whole other podcast, probably, how Japanese cable works. They do air on television, but television works very differently. But it's a whole other system. But yes, the way that you mean it, yes, that's true.
Yeah, so their only money is ticket sales.
Pretty much, yeah.
So if they're paying the rent to rent a massive building and only drawing a few thousand people, they're losing money on the show.
It's also worth mentioning that there aren't that many buildings in Japan to run. I mean, it's especially if you're running like a show of like 5,000 people or more, you have very limited options. So if you're trying to run a big show, you're pretty much pigeonholed into the Tokyo Dome, or you have to go into the much smaller Kurikan Hall. Yeah. And that's just kind of the way it is.
Yeah, so you're either like in America, you've got a basketball arena with 10,
Right.
12,000 seats in every major city. You have your choice.
Let us say you can either pigeonhole yourself into no more than 8,000 tickets, or go for 30,000 and take a bath if you're wrong.
Yeah. So this company is in very dire straits, and now we get to talk about the good story, how they turn this around.
Yay!
And I think, yeah, it's nice to have a success story after what we've just talked about. I think it probably starts with the new Three Musketeers: Tanahashi, Nakamura, and Shibata.
And it's funny because they called them the new Three Musketeers because just like the other three, they all come up at the same time and basically the same class. And the funniest thing about it is that Shibata is thought in the beginning to be clearly the one with the most potential. He's the next star. But Shibata doesn't give a fuck about pro wrestling and just kind of wanders off into the world of MMA after a couple of years. And it's such a betrayal to New Japan at that point that he almost was not forgiven for when he eventually came back. It was a gigantic deal because there are a lot of wrestlers in the locker room, Tanahashi especially, who had not forgiven him for betraying them that way. It was giant news. But the two main ones that we're going to focus on are Tanahashi and Nakamura, who you guys obviously know. If you've not been living under a rock. Also ironic that they did not want Tanahashi to be their star. They didn't even want him really to be a star. This company wanted Shinsuke Nakamura. They wanted Shinsuke Nakamura, the rookie sensation, the true heir to strong style, because he had actually fought in MMA fights and won.
Yeah.
Like he had like a 2-1 record, but for these guys,
wow.
That's incredible.
Yeah. Compared to these guys who were getting squashed in 30 seconds.
Exactly. He could actually fight. So he was the dream. He was the guy. You know how Randy Orton was the guy that Vince fixated on because he was just the picture of what Vince wanted a wrestler to be?
Yeah.
That's Shinsuke. He's exactly what Inoki wants a wrestler to be. Yeah. But the problem is that he sucks. He doesn't suck in the ring. He's just boring, and he has no personality.
Yeah, which is amazing to say if you've only seen him today.
Yes. That is something...
Like today, he's not really that good in the ring, in my opinion, but he's just dripping with charisma.
And that is something that he invents out of left field. As the company is almost in danger of leaving him behind, he has a performance art background, and he just went and studied some Michael Jackson tapes, and one day he just became Shinsuke Nakamura and never looked back.
Yeah, so in his original presentation, he's just like, he's got a short haircut, he's in like long black tights. I haven't seen his entrance, but I assume he just kind of stoically walked to the ring.
Stoic, that's the word, stoic. All of New Japan's biggest stars ever were stoic. The one that was the closest to not being that was Keiji Muto, who showed emotion and had charisma. But even he, in his Keiji Muto form, not the Great Muta, was stoic. Because that's what you were meant to be. Yeah. A stoic, lonely warrior.
A quiet warrior in the Japanese tradition.
Exactly.
I mean, I don't want to step into Japanese culture here, but Japanese culture just strikes me as being very reserved and disciplined and serious.
Yes. But the idea that there was that undercurrent of the unbeatable, the one who will never step back badass is what drew. That's the thing that drew. Misawa was like that. Kobashi was like it. And then like the idea that those guys would fire up in a match and show their inner reserve of burning badassery. That's what drew in Japanese wrestling for 30 years. Hiroshi Tanahashi was not that. So they didn't want him. He was trying to be Shawn Michaels at a time where there was no Shawn Michaels room to be had. Yeah. And it's kind of funny that Tanahashi and Nakamura will always be inexorably linked. At one point, they were sent off on an excursion to be a tag team. Faced each other when they were both still very young in the main event of a Wrestle Kingdom for the under 30 championship. Like they'll always be linked together in that way. They're the ultimate foil for each other, or at least they were until someone replaced Nakamura in that role. But over time, it just became so clear that despite their best efforts, Nakamura wasn't working and Tanahashi was waiting.
What made them finally go with Tanahashi?
They always knew that Tanahashi would be there. And it was just kind of a situation of circumstance. Like at a time in the mid-thousands where they were just throwing the belt on anybody, Tanahashi was the only one that worked. And there was also the situation where somewhere in the mid-thousands, and I can't pin down the date, I wish I could for you, Jado and Gato become the bookers of New Japan. This is gigantic. Like this, Tanahashi is already well established as a champion, and maybe even as the ace by that point. But they are the ones who begin changing the dynamic of what the company is meant to be. They're the ones who wrestled in Wrestle and Romance. They know the Mexican style from Ultimo Dragon. They know the American style from WCW and Chris Jericho. Like they have all these influences. And they decide to bring sports entertainment to Japan. And that's when the company really crafts itself around Tanahashi, because he's the one who can do that for them. He's the one who's going to lead them out of the era of the stoic badass and into the era of the smiling sports entertainment charisma machine.
So I think we finally get our torch passing at Wrestle Kingdom 3 in 2009, Tanahashi against Muto.
Yes. Kaiji Muto comes back and he wins the IWGP title. And he actually won the Triple Crown title in All Japan like the same year. Like he wins everything. Like this is the year of Muto's big comeback, his last ride. Okay, he wins everything. He's the best wrestler in the world. He recaptures his former greatness. And then at Wrestle Kingdom, in a match where they mirror each other, and that's very important because Muto was such a big influence on Tanahashi. Tanahashi beats Muto definitively, clean for the title. That he's better, he's younger, he's the man now. And after that, he calls himself the ace of the universe, and that's what he is. And finally, it's the first hopeful day for New Japan. Wrestlers have said that they could feel it in the locker room. Like fans have said, like, that's the day I felt it turn around. They finally passed the fucking torch.
It's just amazing to me that it's 2009. This company's been around for almost 30 years, and this is our first actual torch passing. Whereas this is just the most standard thing in American wrestling. When WWE wants to make Roman Reigns, they have him beat The Undertaker, Triple H, John Cena, Brock Lesnar, every big star they can come up with. We're going to put Reigns over him. Here, this just hasn't happened for some reason.
Another thing that I want to make perfectly clear is that, remember how I told you that all these guys debuted in the early thousands? That's because this took 7 years for them to get Tanahashi to this point. For reference, 7 years ago, Roman Reigns wasn't even on the main roster. Like, not even close. Like, that's Undertaker versus Shawn Michaels 2.
Yeah, I think 7 years ago may have been Roman Reigns' senior year at Georgia Tech.
Like, it's wild how much faster, like how long they waited, how unsure they were about him. And then finally, when it was time, this is the day that marks the beginning of the new era of New Japan. And thank Christ.
Yeah, in 2011, they finally turn a profit. They tour the USA for the first time. And the card company, but they'd already bought into the company, but this is where they buy 100% of the company. Bushiroad?
Yeah. I remember vividly thinking at the time, like, what the fuck? This is horrible. This is going to bury the company. They're going to turn it into like a kid thing. They've actually been incredible owners for them. They do like a lot of tie-ins with the card games and like commercials and stuff, but it's actually been great. Like they've done a really good job with it.
It seems like a natural fit.
Yeah.
So yeah, the upswing continues. 2013, we get the debut of the Bullet Club. This is still going, and this is probably something that casual New Japan fans connect to most because it's Americans. But it just seems like the most basic concept to me that you'd have a bunch of white American dudes. I guess they weren't all Americans. They had Prince Devitt in there originally, but white foreigners like coming in and being shitheads just seems like natural heat in Japan.
Bullet Club. It's awesome to think that Bullet Club has become this great, huge thing because originally it only existed because Prince Devitt was the guy that they decided was going to break the junior heavyweight barrier. He had such star power and so much support from the fans and like so much interest, and he was so, let's be frank, goddamn good looking.
Yeah.
But they were like, we don't care that he's 180 pounds. We're pushing him to the main event. How do we do that? How will we make the fans accept that he could beat these guys? And that's why when they formed Bullet Club, which was a stable of shitheads that Prince Devitt would use, and they cheated in every match. And that's all it was at first, just a classic American heel stable.
But that's barrier breaking in Japan, because
Absolutely.
Japan, they book it like a sport. There's no cheating.
And this
There's
is
no
another
run-ins. There's no bumped refs or distractions. They don't do that kind of thing. Guys fight, and one guy wins and one guy loses, but they win and they lose with honor.
Yeah, I mean there are exceptions, obviously, but there's acts like this did not exist in mainstream Japanese wrestling. They just didn't. Like that's just how it was. And it's interesting because it winds up working very well. But Prince Devitt isn't even in Bullet Club for very long. I don't think it's even a year before he leaves.
Yeah,
like something
basically a year or less before he leaves for WWE.
But it's so incredibly successful. And the Bullet
I swing they get AJ Styles to replace him.
Absolutely. And all of this is part of the like discussing the concept of gaijin in Japan is probably the topic of a whole other podcast, to be perfectly honest with you. But gaijin were always lesser in Japan. They had to be. They would bring in monsters from America for their heroes to defeat in the Rikidozan model, which they kept using probably right up until like 2010. Like that's like a 60-year-old model. In much the same way that Vince still does the patriotic American versus the nasty foreign heel, it was the same idea. Gaijin were heels to be defeated. They weren't cool, charismatic people who won. And that was another way that the Bullet Club broke ground, is Gaijin were always at the fringes of New Japan. Homeland Japanese wrestlers were always who they focused on. We told you about the dojo system. If you didn't come from within New Japan, who the fuck were you? Now, all of a sudden, gaijin are coming in from everywhere. Foreign wrestlers are coming from England. They're coming from Europe. They're coming from America. They're coming from islands. They're coming from everywhere. There had never been anything really like that. And Bullet Club is what made it okay. You could get over immediately. And it was just a heat machine, like nothing I've ever seen in New Japan.
Yeah. So 2013 seems like a key year. This is where Tanahashi and Okada face off at Wrestle Kingdom for the first time. These guys have headlined a number of Wrestle Kingdoms. This is, I think, probably the era-defining feud.
If you asked me point blank to name the greatest feud in wrestling history, I would name Tanahashi versus Okada. It's really hard for me to boil down why that is, and I'm trying to be brief and not just lecture people so that you guys will actually keep listening. But basically, the idea is this ace, this guy who worked for 7 years to finally make it to the top. He's a good man. He smiles. Like, literally, his catchphrase is, "I love you all." Like, that's that kind of guy. Like, more John Cena than John Cena. And up comes this disrespectful shithead punk who's way more talented, who wants his spot. And they feud over this for 4 years. And it's every time they touch, it's electric. Every match they have is unreal and builds off of every prior interaction they've ever had. The more of them that you watch, even like their tag matches, their six-mans, the more you appreciate the matches that they have because they all tell one coherent story from start to finish. And the first Tanahashi versus Okada Wrestle Kingdom event is unbelievable. But the one at Wrestle Kingdom 9, the one where everybody knows Okada's going to win and finally take over the role, and he doesn't, is maybe the best match I've ever seen.
Better than the 6-star match?
Yeah.
I like that match. I thought it was really good.
Yes. And let's not discredit that at all. Like,
We'll get to it in a second.
right?
I don't want to crack out. It's just the whole 6 stars, 6.25. I find it kind of silly, but yeah, it doesn't. I don't mean to demean it because yeah, I thought it was a tremendous, tremendous match.
Yeah. In my reviews on the blog of Tanahashi versus Okada match, they all got 100 out of 100. And by the end, I was just saying like these ratings don't mean anything anymore because like they're not expressing properly the degree to which I'm happy. Like they're like this is a perfect feud executed perfectly. And
Well, that's what I'll say is like for a long before I really started watching New Japan, I would just sort of see Meltzer's star ratings and just kind of roll my eyes because it was like, oh, another 5 star, another 5 star. There were 3 5 star matches on this show, but then I started watching them. It's like these are unbelievable wrestling matches.
And they've kind of perfected this concept of wrestling, the style of wrestling. And it's very similar to like kind of the WWE main event style of wrestling with multiple like near falls and like big moves. Oh no, like everybody unloading their arsenal. But the concept of a New Japan match is you have to hit the right sequence of moves in order to win. Like you've got to hit 2 sling blades and then 2 high fly flows. And if you can manage to do that, you can beat anybody in the world. But can you hit those moves? That's what it boils down to in a New Japan match. Whereas in a WWE match, it's can you hit your finisher? Like that's basically what it is. And if they kick out, can you hit your super finish off the top rope?
Yeah. So as we mentioned in 2014, AJ Styles comes to New Japan. He ends up having a great run. Wrestle Kingdom 8 in 2014, we get Okada versus Naito for the IWGP title, which is also the main event this year, coincidentally, and Nakamura versus Tanahashi for the Intercontinental title.
It was actually a fascinating thing in New Japan history and plays a huge part in this year's event too. If you're planning on watching this year's event, is they let the fans vote.
That's cool.
Because they felt like Okada and Naito didn't have a ton of heat on it. And Nakamura versus Tanahashi for the Intercontinental title was going to be the semi-main event. So they let the fans vote, what do you want to be the real main event? And Nakamura Tanahashi destroyed Okada and Naito. Just left them in ruins.
Like it was interesting. And the Intercontinental title was not established as a big belt at that point, right?
Yeah, Nakamura had taken it and basically had made it his belt, but not for a ton of time by that point. That was more in 2015 that he established it like that.
Yeah. 2015, Nakamura versus Ibushi, and this time Tanahashi versus Okada. Just a continuing upward trend.
Absolutely. Like the string of shows between Wrestle Kingdom 7 and 9, untouchable. I don't know that the quality of the shows from top to bottom has been as good since, but those are 3 of the finest shows you'll ever watch in your life.
Well, it's understandable they lost a lot of these top guys the next year.
Yeah, they do.
So let's get to 2016, where WWE raids New Japan. They sign Shinsuke Nakamura, AJ Styles, and Gallows and Anderson, kind of in one swoop. I remember, kind of waking up to this news on an early January morning and being pretty stunned by it.
It's pretty incredible because for a long time, New Japan would only do 1-year contracts for all of their talent. And that seems crazy.
Well, and they would expire right after the January 4th show.
Yeah, so you could just walk away. Now, what that did was it really helped them get a lot of this talent from outside to help for that big show, right? You could get talent from all other promotions from all over the world. It was easy to bring Gaijin in, and then when they were done with their run, tour's over, kid, get out. That made sense. But then stuff like this started happening, and they had to smarten up really quick. And there were also rumors that like Okada was going to jump.
Yeah, I remember that. It was just surreal. It was like anybody could leave. Who's going next?
And they had to smarten up real quick, and all of a sudden those multi-year contracts started getting handed out. I'm pretty sure that Okada has like a 10-year contract.
It's one of those things that probably help them in the long run, and it's better for them to be able to know we've got this guy for 5 years because they book long term.
But this is such a sign of how different things were from even just like 8 years prior, is that if they had taken even one top star from New Japan in the late thousands, it would have been over. All the momentum would have been lost. It would have been dead. They lost 2 main eventers in their top tag team, didn't blink.
Yeah, so I remember at the time thinking, okay, New Japan's had a really good run, but they just got absolutely devastated, just lost a bunch of their top guys. At best, they're just going to take a step back. But instead, they're hotter than ever. How did that happen?
Well, two primary things happened. One is that they realized, it's not that they realized like they hadn't known before, but they finally got the ability to step into the American market. They had always wanted to make inroads into the American market. They had tried many times, but until New Japan World became a thing. And it's actually funny because Jeff Jarrett is partially to thank for
God
us
damn it.
enjoying New Japan in the way we do now. Because I believe it was Wrestle Kingdom 9, which was the one that one of them, Global
Yeah,
Force Wrestling.
I think that was 20. I think it was 2015.
So
That was
that would
also
be
the one.
9.
That was the first one with Jim Ross on commentary.
Yes, that's correct. So literally, they air it on American pay-per-view with their pay-per-view contacts. And
Yep.
so
It
Jeff
did,
Jarrett,
it did a surprising number of buys too, if I'm remembering.
I was watching live that night. It was an amazing success that helped establish them in this marketplace. And then when they launched New Japan World, they gave the ability for anybody to watch any of the shows. It was a total fucking game changer.
For just 999 yen a month.
999, which was a stroke of genius.
Which is like eight American dollars or something like that.
But just to poke fun at WWE's $9.99 was, I love that so much. But like by giving them the ability for anybody to watch, and then beginning to run a couple shows here and there, making a partnership with Ring of Honor to get their talent more exposed, to having the deal on Access TV, which actually is watched by more people than TNA is.
Yep.
They made these strides into America, and that boosted their visibility. And that's all that they needed was those eyes. Because in Japan, there's a limited number of people who can possibly watch your product. It's not a gigantic country full of people. But now they've started to make inroads into China, into Indonesia, into India, into America. And now so many more eyes are on them that we've created. There are only two global wrestling companies, WWE and New Japan. And the days when they're going to start a fussing and a feuding, not far off, man.
I think New Japan is the unquestioned number 2 in the world at this point, and the number 2 in America. I mean, when they ran that Long Beach show and sold out with over 5,000 people, there's no other American promotion that can do that other than WWE.
And I just want to make this perfectly clear. I'm not saying that there's a war between New Japan and WWE, but WWE rated them, and Chris Jericho is appearing on Wrestle Kingdom this year. That's the first time anyone's ever taken somebody WWE actually had a use for since WCW.
It's been a while. We'll get to Jericho in a second. Let's first go into how did they keep where did Kenny Omega come from? Is kind of my big question. Is I had never heard of him, even though I was kind of following New Japan for the couple years before this. And then suddenly he's headlining the Tokyo Dome, and him and Okada have this unbelievable match, which I guess everybody famously knows Dave Meltzer rated 6 stars because it was the best wrestling match he thought he had ever seen.
Kenny Omega is actually a fascinating success story. He was an indie wrestler in the early thousands when everybody was an indie wrestler. He did some PWG stuff, but mostly he went to Japan. And he became a mainstay for DDT, Japan's like wacky little promotion. They were like sometimes have like ladders and washing machines win titles and blow up dolls.
This is where he wrestled the blow up doll and the other stuff that caused Jim Cornette to issue a fatwa against him.
Where he sold for a little girl. Yeah, that whole thing.
Yeah. People are still not over this 10 years later.
But I'm sure that you've seen the GIFs online, and that's all it was for him. And he struck up an amazing real-life friendship with Kota Ibushi, who was... Kota Ibushi is the closest thing to Jeff Hardy that is not Jeff Hardy. He could be the biggest star in the entire wrestling world, but he just kind of drifts in and out like, whatever, who cares? He would rather be wrestling in a forest in front of 10 people than wrestling at the Tokyo Dome.
WWE built the Cruiserweight Classic around him, and there's like, nah, I don't think I want to do it. Sorry.
Yep. That is The Kota Ibushiest thing imaginable.
And that's how we ended up with TJ Perkins winning the Cruiserweight title.
Yeah, that he's to blame. Hiroshi Tanahashi has straight up said, no matter what happens in this company, as long as we have Ibushi, the future is safe. And they don't have Ibushi. But so they became a tag team and feuded off and on, and they came to Japan together as a tag team called the Golden Lovers, which is great. And they were just junior heavyweight wrestlers. And then eventually the heel turn happens for Omega. He joins the Bullet Club as the cleaner, Kenny Omega. And he was supposed to be sort of their, like the Tully Blanchard, the Intercontinental level guy, to AJ Styles. And the intention was to bring him along slowly, and then eventually he'd go to the main event. Well, when AJ leaves, the Bullet Club needs a new leader.
Yeah, he's now the top foreign white, I mean, not American because he's Canadian, but foreign white dude on the roster.
No, it's impossible to think that he deserved to be in that spot yet. He hadn't been pushed to that spot yet. He had barely left the junior heavyweight division. He hadn't even had that many really great matches yet. But he goes on a 6-month run of matches that are maybe unmatched by anything I've ever seen. Like, he comes out of nowhere and starts having literally 5-star matches every time he touches a ring. And it culminates in this match at Wrestle Kingdom against Okada, where he pulls out, he's an exceptionally athletic and talented guy. He pulls out things that I've never seen anyone else try. He pulls out like a moonsault over the guardrail 20 feet away that like Rob Van Dam would drop his jaw at.
Yeah. If you haven't watched this match, it's fantastic. It's 45 minutes long, but it's absolutely worth your time.
It just became something special. Okada and Omega have that, what you would think is once-in-a-lifetime chemistry, except that Okada also has that with Naito and Tanahashi. So there's always actually been a question of, is Kazuchika Okada one of the best wrestlers alive, or does he just have great chemistry with the best wrestlers alive? And we may not know the answer to that question, but who gives a shit?
No, I mean, it would be fascinating if he ever went to WWE to see how he would adapt.
Exactly. Like, I honestly think that he could, because he's 6'3" and looks like $1 million and can speak a little English, but who knows?
And so that brings us to the present. It's Wrestle Kingdom 12. Okada and Naito are facing off for the IWGP Heavyweight Championship. I think the expectation is this might be finally time for Okada's amazingly long title run to end. He's been champion for over 1.5 years at this point.
Oh, yeah. And this is finally time for Tetsuya Naito to step up and be the man for the first time, which his story is a whole other story for a whole other time. But much like Tanahashi, it's been about 6 years, or 6 or 7 years, that everybody has said, that's the next guy, and it hasn't happened. And now it may actually happen.
These builds are just fascinatingly slow compared to American wrestling.
And that's part of what makes them so resonate so much and be so impactful and get these like high star ratings. It's because when it's Roman Reigns versus John Cena with 3 weeks of build, how good could the match possibly be? How much could you possibly care? When it's Okada versus Tanahashi and it's been building for 4 years, you're talking
they
about
have all these
else.
previous matches they can build on.
Exactly. Nobody big touches unless it matters. And that's always something special that they've had over other companies.
And then the match that I think American fans are anticipating the most is Chris Jericho against Kenny Omega. As we mentioned, this dropped my jaw when I woke up one morning, looked at Twitter, and saw the headline Chris Jericho debuts in New Japan Pro Wrestling. How the hell did they pull this off?
It's the Winnipeg connection, man.
Don Callis.
I think the answer is honestly Don Callis, who was working in some capacity as a color commentator there, but also I would have to assume some sort of close friend of Kenny Omega's in real life. It certainly seems that way from the way they talk about each other. But
they're both Canadian guys.
But also Jericho is very good friends with Jado and Gato. Has worked with them has worked with them before. It's not hard to see where the connections could come in. And Chris Jericho
almost killed him at Halloween Havoc 97.
That's a very good point. It's amazing they are friends after that shit. Yeah. But it's not hard to see because Jericho has always been that guy who sees the next big thing coming and wants
Yes.
it to be him. You know what I mean?
For better or for worse, I think you can take that as either a compliment or a criticism, and in some ways it's both.
He has similar qualities to Hogan in that way. Like,
Yeah.
hey, I see you coming up, brother. How can I get a piece?
Yeah, it's like when the WWF was sinking in the early 90s and Japan was hot, Hogan was suddenly more interested in working in Japan than he was in the WWF.
It's kind of similar, but it also registers as Jericho says, and I don't necessarily believe him, and I know like Bruce Pritchard and them don't really either, that he didn't tell Vince he was going to New Japan. He defected. We don't know for how long, but that's huge.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing with Jericho is I think they've always just understood he's going to do his own shit. Like, he's going to go off and make his music and do his tours and whatever else, and he's going to be in and out. It's not like I think they were really planning anything big with him anyway.
What makes me think, though, is that, do you remember when Christian went to TNA and all of a sudden that became an option for guys and suddenly people started going to TNA?
That this breaks. Well, I think Cody Rhodes kind of broke the floodgates too.
Yeah, in a definite way. Like, now it's, if you leave WWE and you got a name, there's a place to go where you could make the same money and be a bigger deal. And that's a big thing, man. Cody Rhodes is a way bigger deal now than he was in WWE.
Oh yeah, that's what I'd say is if Cody came back to WWE, he would be so fun. I mean, he was nowhere because he was Stardust and doing jobs on Superstars, but he would be bigger now than he had probably ever been based on what he had done.
Absolutely. And we're looking into a future where, I mean, is Daniel Bryan going to wrestle for New Japan?
Yes.
Yes.
I will go on record and say Daniel Bryan's back in the ring, probably either before the end of this year or at the next Tokyo Dome show in 2018. It'll be 2019 by then. But yeah, his contract's up in September. He's gone. I mean, he may end up wrestling at that big show that Cody and the Young Bucks are putting on. That wouldn't shock me either.
And this is kind of what WCW looked like before the floodgates broke and it became a real war. As they start attracting the, kind of the fringe guys, the guys that were ready to leave, the older guys that are looking for other opportunities, the guys WWE
they get a Jake Roberts, they get a Rick Rude, that kind of thing.
They get like a Randy Savage who's not really being used anymore. He's a color commentator. And then once you get enough of those guys, people really start looking at it as an option. And I'm not saying that New Japan can compete with WWE. At this point, they don't have the infrastructure, they don't have the history, they don't have the star power.
They don't have the distribution. They're on a cable channel that nobody gets.
But I'm not saying that in 5 years we might be looking at this very differently.
It's hard. It would take them getting somebody like Danielson or Punk who can, because they need guys who American fans know, who ability, and get them to pay attention to who the Japanese guys are, because they just come over, I think, with a bunch of Japanese guys, it's just not going to click. Having Daniel Bryan, if he can have a real run, if his health permits that, Punk, if he decides he wants to do pro wrestling again, which I expect he'll get the itch again at some point, and New Japan seems like the most natural place for him to go.
I just wonder, who would it take? Like, the equivalent would be like what, John Cena going to New Japan?
I don't know what that looks like, but it would be so fascinating. I mean, yeah, what you're saying is that's the equivalent today of Hogan. Is John Cena, or The Rock maybe is a better comparison.
Jesus, that would be fucking.
John Cena's John Cena's the biggest, kind of full-time wrestler. The Rock hasn't wrestled a match in 5 years now.
The Rock versus Okada. Don't even start with me.
Yeah, I mean, we know that The Rock probably can't wrestle anymore. At least as his movie's career continues to roll along the way it is. He's not getting back in the ring. So Cena is kind of the biggest available.
And these are obviously like pie in the sky speculations. We're just having fun with some fantasy booking here.
I don't think Punk and Danielson are at all. Like,
no, yeah, for sure. They're free agents.
Punk's
pretty much.
probably never going to have another UFC fight. I don't think that's happening. If he wanted to get booked, he could get booked. It's just he doesn't want to wrestle right now. And Danielson very much wants to wrestle, but WWE won't let him. And his contract is going to be up in September. And I think all signs point to him getting back in the ring somewhere other than WWE.
There's just going to come a day where somebody WWE wants to keep, wants to push. A young person is going to jump ship. And then it's going to get real goddamn interesting.
So
I don't know who that is. But
this Wrestle Kingdom is shaping up to be the biggest dome show in probably 20 years.
Oh, yeah.
Reportedly, they've already sold 40,000 tickets, and these shows normally have a heavy walk-up.
Yep.
But even if there were zero walk-up, 40,000 would still be the most they'd sold in 20 years.
Yeah, since Wrestle Kingdom started at the very least. Like, it's since the 90s.
Yeah. They're absolutely, I mean, they're just booming. And this, I mean, you got a huge double main event. Okada Naito, the Jericho Omega match has been built really well. It's another case of, it seems like they sort of took kind of basic American wrestling angles. They got in a fight at the press conference and Jericho beat him up and Omega bladed. And that's just the kind of thing that's not normally done in Japanese wrestling. And that's really produced a lot of heat.
Yeah. Like, I think they can really go somewhere with this. And I would be very surprised.
I think
honestly,
Jericho's probably going to stick around would be my guess.
I would guess that Jericho's going to win that match and challenge Naito for the title.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know how long he's staying for, but those two things I would almost guarantee.
I mean, if he only has to do a couple big matches a year, I don't see why he couldn't do this for a while.
And the good thing about wrestling in New Japan as well is that there are prolonged breaks. Like, in between, after every major show, they usually get like a week off. And then in the build to the next show, you're just in six-mans. Like, you're not doing any real wrestling. The top stars are allowed to rest significantly.
Yeah,
it's a good thing. That's why a lot of Japanese wrestlers keep wrestling into like their 40s and 50s.
And that's how when I watch the big matches and I see the bumps they take, and I'm like, how are these guys not dead? But they only wrestle that way on the big shows. There's no equivalent of Raw in New Japan. There's no big TV show they have to wrestle on every week, and the house shows are all tag matches, so they limit the bumps, and I'm sure they just don't work like that in the normal matches.
Yeah, you don't take 3 burning hammers and then hustle to Poughkeepsie to make a house show the next morning. That's just not how it is.
Yeah, whereas in American wrestling, we just expect that guys are going to go balls out every night in front of 2,000 people.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I mean, yeah, we actually got through that faster than I expected. Is there anything else you want to talk about either for Wrestle Kingdom this year or for the history of New Japan generally?
Dude, there's so many other things that I want to talk about. I want to go into dramatic depth on every Wrestle Kingdom that has ever happened, from Kensuke Sasaki to Tetsuya Naito. I want to talk about Jushin Liger and the CTU. I want to talk about the Pride boom specifically, and how Kevin Randleman never came over when he was expected to. And I want to talk about, but I got to cut myself off at some point, man.
Nobody wants to hear all this right now.
I'm trying to be good.
Yeah, but I mean, it's just sort of it's a fascinating story. And if anything, I think the most interesting part is this current renewal, but really the fact that they survived having their roster rated the way they did is what's amazing to me.
Absolutely.
That after losing a bunch of their top stars, not only did they not take a step back, but they're now doing the best they have in 20 years. They're at a level above where they were at the previous recent peak when they had Nakamura and AJ Styles.
If you consider the NWA and WCW to be two separate companies, which I think is mostly fair to do.
I would.
Then I think WWE and New Japan are the only two companies ever to have a boom, hit rock bottom, and have a second boom. And
it's pretty rare.
That's incredible. And it's not something that you could have predicted. I remember in the early thousands, everyone dismissed New Japan as a thing that didn't even matter. It was arguably at one point the 5th biggest promotion in Japan.
That's crazy.
And now here we are. It's the only one that matters. It owns the country of Japan. It's challenging WWE. This, no one could have seen it coming.
All Japan still number 2 in Japan?
There are a lot of rats fighting over the title of number 2.
What and like how big are these number 2 companies? Is it like the gap between WWE and TNA in America?
It's like the gap between WWE and Chikara.
Oh, okay. Really, really, really big.
I'm exaggerating a little bit, but it's at least the difference between like TNA and Ring of Honor, like companies that could never in a million years dream of challenging them, but can still occasionally draw a kind of a good house, you know?
Yeah. So unquestioned number 1 in Japan. I think, in my view, definitely number 2 in America.
Yep.
And only growing.
Yeah. And you guys, I can't recommend Wrestle Kingdom to you enough. This is,
yeah, absolutely.
as a yearly spectacle, like it's second only to WrestleMania, and several of them have been much, much better than the WrestleMania of the same year. It's an experience to share live. There's a whole community of us that get on Twitter and watch the whole damn thing all the way till 5 a.m. And
yeah,
it's a special.
I'll be watching it the next morning.
Yeah.
Will not be staying up all night. But the other thing is, if you're not a weirdo and don't want to watch the entire 5-hour show, they structure it so all the big matches are at the end. So what do you really need to watch? The last 2 hours is where it tends to really get hot.
Yeah, all the people out there who have kids, I always say the same thing. Go to sleep at 10 o'clock, wake your ass up at 1, watch the rest of the show.
Yeah.
Or wake your ass up at 3, watch the last 2 hours. After the intermission, you're set. It's all good.
Yeah, it's a ridiculously long, although the New Japan Rumble is a favorite of mine because such weird people show up in it.
Billy Gunn was in it last year.
Yeah. Ming has been in it in recent years. Just, yeah.
It was almost
completely
won by
random.
Cheeseburger last year. Cheeseburger.
Yeah, so I can't, even if you you can get it with the American commentary. They'll fill you in on what the stories are. Even if you haven't watched New Japan before, I'm sure everybody wants to see Chris Jericho in New Japan, if nothing else, and you'll probably find out you're interested in the other stuff too.
Yeah. Like, you don't have to be a gigantic fanboy anymore to enjoy New Japan Pro Wrestling or Japanese wrestling in general. You don't have to be a guy who insists on listening to the Japanese commentary because it just doesn't sound the same with American announcers. You don't have to be a guy who remembers back in the day where you had to like beg people on forums to send you particular matches because there was no other way to know that they existed. You don't have to be a huge fucking nerd anymore in order to enjoy this. I'm so happy, and I will not be done. I cannot go to my grave until each and every single goddamn one of you has a subscription to New Japan World.
Kyush is an evangelist. I'm just a casual fan, but I think the fact that we're in agreement on this suggests you can trust us.
Hell yeah.
Yeah, so does that wrap us up? I think we've got through things faster than we thought we might, but I think we kind of hit everything we wanted to talk about.
Yeah, I think it's all good. Watch Wrestle Kingdom. Please, please, please go back and watch any of these matches or any of these things if any of it sounded interesting to you. Japanese wrestling is an amazing thing that we as American people help to create, and I can't recommend it enough. I just genuinely can't.
Yeah, absolutely. This current New Japan run has been fascinating, and I'm really excited for what the future holds because I think the sky's the limit for where they can go from here.
Oh, yeah.
All right, so that wraps us for this special Rise, Fall, and Rebirth of New Japan Pro Wrestling. I kind of enjoyed going off format a little bit here, and I'm sure we'll do some more shows like this in the future. But next week, we're returning to a much more comfortable place. It's Royal Rumble season, and we're going to take a look at what is, in my opinion, probably the greatest Royal Rumble of them all, the 1992 edition.
Oh, boy, with a tear in my eye.
Yeah, the greatest moment of Ric Flair's life. Certainly, in my view, the greatest Royal Rumble match and a pretty fun undercard, too.
I don't know that I've ever watched this show. I've definitely seen the Royal Rumble, but I'm looking forward to actually seeing all the goddamn weirdos I've come to know and love from this podcast.
Yeah, it's such a great Rumble with so many big stars. The first time they put the WWE title on the line in the Rumble, and it was so iconic that I swear every single year people would come up with scenarios where the title could be on the line in the Rumble again.
Even to this day, yes.
Yeah, I mean, they finally did it again a couple years ago when they made Reigns defend the title in the Rumble. But yeah, for a long time, every single year, we would hope and pray that this would be the year they'd put the belt on the line in the Rumble again. That's how iconic this became.
I only have one question to ask you. Is Nails in this?
Regrettably, no,
Oh,
he
God
is not
damn
with
it.
the company yet.
I guess we'll still enjoy it
Yeah,
anyway.
the whole thing's ruined. So yeah, that to look forward to next week. Tune in next time. We'll talk about the greatest Royal Rumble of them all. Thanks for listening, and we hope we see you again next week.